Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning, CHLY's weekly current affairs show. I'm Joe Pugh. Here's what we're following this week. Newly released neighborhood safety audits showed that around half of people across Nanaimo don't feel safe in their neighborhoods. I spoke with Community Policing Coordinator Christy Wood, who spearheaded the audits to find out about the concerns. I also followed up with Mayor Leonard Krog about whether or not people's fears match reality. Our conversation touched on how he feels council is doing what they can on these issues, but real solutions require help from the province. And we are well into this year's spookiest month. I talked with Steph Kveton, program coordinator with the Nanaimo Museum, to see how they're marking the occasion. And finally, this week marked 20 years on the air for CHLY. Retired VIU professor John Black was instrumental in creating the station, and he told me a little bit about how things got off the ground. First, though, the neighborhood safety audits. Members of 6 neighborhoods were interviewed: Harewood, Brecon Hill, Newcastle, the Old City Quarter, South End, and Downtown. To find out more about how the audits were done and what conclusions we can draw from them, I spoke with Christy Wood, Nanaimo's Community Policing Coordinator. Can we start with a quick primer on the audits themselves? So as I understand it, there are 6 separate studies of different neighborhoods in town. Each one involved longer form conversations with 10 residents of the neighborhood. And then there was also a bigger pre-survey of more people within the neighborhood. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Normally, COVID definitely presented some challenges, and we wanted to make sure that as many people could participate in the audits. So how we started is we started with a pre-audit online survey. The online survey really worked to identify areas of focus within the neighborhood, because these neighborhoods are quite large. And the second thing that it really focused was kind of how people were feeling about their neighborhood, because perceptions of crime and feelings of safety are just as important as looking at crime stats. So those things are really important to be able to inform what the bigger picture looks like in those neighborhoods.
So right away, what were some of the more common or broader conclusions across the different audits? We had 6. So there is a lot of similarities between the neighborhoods, and of course, some differences as well. What we noticed in the audits is that people, residents and businesses are very passionate about their neighborhood. I think all across the board, they all, felt a pride of their neighborhood, and felt a sense of belonging within their neighborhood. So that was really interesting. And then, of course, when we asked specific questions about how people were feeling of safety, that actually varied, quite a bit, from having some neighborhoods where just half of the respondents felt that they were dissatisfied with safety, all the way up until about 80 or just over 80% of respondents feeling that they were dissatisfied with safety. So it was really dependent on the neighborhood. But there you said that the best or the safest neighborhoods, half the people still felt unsafe. I'm wondering if you have any knowledge of these kinds of surveys in other places, maybe in Canada. Do you know, is that very unusual?
I don't think it's very unusual. It's tough to say, in the sense that some neighborhoods, depending on, kind of the demographics of what was happening in the neighborhood, we had quite a few people, participate in the online survey, and then in some we had less. So it's really tricky when you're dealing with social issues like this, because there's so many variables, right down to the demographics, like who's responding. Everybody, has a diverse life experience. So whether you're Caucasian or you're BIPOC, or, whether you're LGBTQ plus, or all those things will totally affect levels of safety within there. And so I think you'll get that variation across Canada, depending on who's answering that.
And speaking of who's answering that, I know because of COVID protocols, the sort of longer form discussions were capped at 10 people. How were those 10 people selected, and how do you make sure that you don't get the 10 people who are really interested in doing a survey like this and maybe just have the loudest voices?
Yeah, that's always the magic question of making sure everybody has access. So that's why we definitely did the online survey. We tried to get that out as much as possible, and we did that a variety of ways of doing it online, as well as we had our community policing volunteers and students head out and canvass the neighborhood just to try to start getting people engaged. We reached out to neighborhood associations, block watches, and tried to do as much of that. And so we were very lucky in the sense that we got over 700 people respond to the online survey. So that was great. And as far as the group audits, the in-person audits, you're right, we did have to limit those to 10. And how we did it is we, of course, included a little information in the online survey that if people were interested in participating, they could. We reached out to neighborhood associations. And what we did is that if there was a neighborhood that had a large interest in participating in the physical audit, we created what we call these mini audit checklists so that they could go out on their own with another neighbor or maybe their family members and follow the same route and fill out basically the same questions that we were asking in the group dialogue. And that was included in the reports.
And we've talked a lot about some of the broad conclusions from these surveys, the number of people who don't feel safe. More specifically, what are some of the things they don't feel safe about?
I think if you read all the reports, there definitely is some fear related to what we would call our public disorder events. And so those are kind of things that, we're seeing in the neighborhood, whether it's to deal with property crime or, people who might be unpredictable or transient in the neighborhood, and, having mental health issues. Those seem to, increase some of the fear in the sense that I think a lot of the residents and businesses, feel helpless. Like all across the board, when you look at all the neighborhood results, they all want to have more mental health and more housing support for some of our houseless individuals. And I think that, they're supporting, a lot of those kind of initiatives that would be happening. And I think that's where some of the fear comes from in that sense.
And we've also touched on how crime statistics were included along with the perceptions. I'm wondering how those matched up.
Well, it's interesting because if you take a look at the reports, and this is why it's so important to look at a whole bunch of different qualitative and quantitative data sources when you're doing this work, because these are social complex issues. So when you look at some of the crime stats in the neighborhoods, you will see that overall there is a total increase in our reported police incidences. But those are for several factors. One being that there probably is, we can assume that there is an increase to reports being reported to police. The second is that they are influenced by whether people are reporting them or not. So, there may have been a time where people weren't recognizing that they should be reporting these incidences, and now they're reporting that. So that will also, reflect in the increase in reporting incidences. And thirdly, I talk about it in the reports, but in 2019, the Uniform Crime Reporting Survey, the UCR is what we call it, changed their methodology to become a more victim-centered approach. And so what that means is that all incidences that are being reported to police are now collected in the stats, whereas prior to 2019, they can only be collected in the stats through police investigation. So that will automatically bump up some of those stats in there. So when we take a look at, some of the tables that are located in the reports, you'll see that, offenses such as general occurrences or suspicious occurrences have increased. And we were told that when we changed the methodology in the UCR reporting survey, you would see an automatic increase. However, those general occurrence type incidences include things like mental health, well-being checks. They include Trespass Act. They include Safe Streets. So a lot of the stuff in there would include things that we would normally associate with what we call public or social disorder type of events. And so those are on the increase. But when you look at some of the other crimes, you can notice that there are some trends that might be happening, but some just really consistent across the board. And it varies from neighborhood to neighborhood.
Okay, so if I understand that correctly, there was a general increase in sort of the number of calls, but that could as well be caused by the fact that we've recently changed the way we record what counts as a call?
Yes, that's right. That changed in January 1, 2019.
Got it.
So the great thing that's happening now is that the plan is, we can come back to these neighborhoods in 2 or 3 years and then really have a solid baseline to check back, especially, in relationship to the crime statistic data.
Right. And talking about the future, how does this data get used now?
Yeah, so what we're doing, and you can see from the report, is that we currently am working with the neighborhood associations and block watches and other residents and businesses who generally want to be involved in looking at some of the recommendations for incorporating some crime prevention initiatives. Of course, I tell them right from the get-go that we're not going to solve, the opioid crisis, the mental health crisis, or the housing crisis. Here is really just about what we can do at the grassroots level to reduce some of those opportunities and help, neighbors and businesses feel a little bit safer. So we're working on, what recommendations they think would work in their neighborhood, and then community policing services will support them in carrying out those recommendations. So that's kind of the next steps as far as that goes.
Are there any kind of concrete examples you could give of something that community policing would get as a recommendation to carry out in a neighborhood?
Yeah, for sure. So there's quite a few, but one of the examples is implementing some targeted community policing programs within the neighborhood. So an example is we have a crime watch program where we have trained volunteers who go out in a community policing marked van, and they kind of act as the ears and eyes for the neighborhood as well as police, and they have a direct link to bylaws as well as to police for reporting any kind of crime or suspicious activity or even sanitation issues. They can report that directly to Public Works. So that's just an example of one of the things that we talk about. The other thing is some of these neighborhoods, face some, what we call, property crime through opportunity, right? So a lot of that just requires, how do we educate residents on protecting their property, locking their doors? How do we create visibility within their property so it's not targeted, to have that opportunity? So working with residents, with our community policing volunteers and doing home security checks. For larger properties, we can do what we call a crime prevention through environmental design assessment, where we take a look at their property. We look at some of the physical elements that may be contributing to that opportunity of crime, but we also take the social context. And maybe there's an opportunity to partner up with other agencies in that neighborhood for them to be able to work together to increase safety.
And one of the things we've kind of talked to on the show in some of our conversations with the RCMP is that in general across Nanaimo, it seems like the number of calls to the RCMP are up, and that includes a lot of things that they don't necessarily have the resources or time or shouldn't be dealing with. I'm wondering if kind of the increased perception of fear in the neighborhood, how that can contribute to that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I know it's come up several times when we talk about, using the audits as a tool, for, kind of capturing a snapshot of what's kind of happening in the neighborhood. And the issue is that when we have fear, and are worried about our safety, it really affects our behavior in the neighborhood. So that can kind of play out in several ways. So one may be that, they might be calling the police more for things that they might have not called in the past for. The other thing it could be is that it will affect their behavior as they move through the neighborhood. One of the things that we know about safety is that the more positive activity that's happening in a neighborhood, the more gatherings, the more coming together, the more you're letting your kids play outside, the more you're walking to the store, that increases safety in a neighborhood. But if you're too fearful to do that, what you're actually doing is kind of perpetuating that fear. And it's totally understandable, but that's kind of the vicious cycle of that level of fear. And that's why it's really important to address those. And
anything else you'd like to add on these audits or community policing in Nanaimo?
I just think, it's been really telling in the sense that people are really compassionate and caring about their neighborhood and really want to make it a safe place for everybody. And I think that, the levels of participation really illustrate that. And I think the more we can come together and collaborate on that, I think we can really, start to increase levels of safety for everybody. And I'm hoping that next year in the winter, we'll be able to carry on some of the safety audit reports in other neighborhoods who would like to have this happen. And then, come back in a few years to these neighborhoods and check back and see if the crime prevention initiatives that were implemented, made a difference. Where were the gaps? How are people feeling about their neighborhood, and what do the crime stats actually say as well?
Coordinator Wood, thank you so much for taking some time to speak with me on this today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Community Policing Coordinator Christy Wood, speaking about Nanaimo's recently released community safety audits. Coordinator Wood presented her findings to Council earlier this week. I was able to speak with Mayor Leonard Krog about the findings from the audits. We're having this discussion about these recently released neighborhood safety audits. They found that in some neighborhoods, as many as 80% of people surveyed don't feel safe. I know you discussed this at Monday's council meeting. Can you tell me, first of all, what that discussion was like?
It was a discussion to inform council. It was simply a report. We weren't being asked to pass motions or take any action. The safety audits arise out of basically neighborhoods working in conjunction with the RCMP, Vancouver Island University, and the city. It's through the Nanaimo Community Policing Program. And so it was a report to let us know how people are feeling, and it also contrasted how people are feeling, if you will, with what the actual crime statistics were. Interestingly, one of the neighborhoods that arguably, of the 6 that were used in this report, that reported one of the highest levels of fear, in fact, had essentially the lowest level of crime. And that's probably attributable to the few people that they spoke to. And so I'm not minimizing the fact that crime takes place in our city, that there are behaviors that are very disturbing, but it is sometimes a perception problem. It's not based on the reality. The other thing is, of course, that we're seeing a number of reports of what they refer to as suspicious occurrences. And sadly, that is often something as simple as a homeless person pushing a cart with their meager possessions through a neighborhood, and people will phone in because that's something that disturbs them.
I'm wondering how this perception of fear in Nanaimo, what some of the issues that can create are from council's perspective, and how we tackle it.
Look, from council's perspective, it means that we are obviously taking action around increased security. We put another $400,000 into private security for the downtown area in particular. We certainly work in conjunction with the RCMP. We don't direct the RCMP. They're not a municipal police force. They are contracted by the province to provide policing services, and the city pays 90% of that cost. But the superintendent, Lisa Fletcher, myself, and our CAO meet monthly to talk about policing issues, and certainly RCMP do report to council from time to time on what's happening, and they ask us what we think the priority should be. Much of what is disturbing for people gets back to the same thing that sadly I've had to, and most mayors in this province and indeed this country have been talking about for a long time, and that is it's the mental health, addictions, brain injury crisis in our streets. It's part of the larger homelessness problem, but people who are not familiar with folks who are unhoused in our streets of this, and there's 600 we estimate still in Nanaimo, sometimes their behaviors, psychotic episodes as a result of mental health issues or taking drugs or whatever, the behavior is extremely frightening if you're not familiar with it, and it enhances a sense of fear, which, as I say, in many cases, it's not a dangerous situation for others. It's certainly potentially a dangerous situation for the individual undergoing a psychotic episode, but it's not a dangerous situation, and it's not criminal. Until those folks on our streets have safe, secure places to live, whether they're unsecure or secure facilities, because I think some need secure facilities, and I've said that over and over again. I think it's going to be hard to deal with the perception that crime is high, because after all, if you do have a drug addiction and you're stealing, as many, indeed probably most are, to support that addiction, it means lots of petty theft and that kind of thing, which again, people find disturbing and upsetting. And sometimes probably don't even bother report to the police because the value is such, or it's below an insurance deductible, or whatever the case may be.
So we've touched on, or you touched on there, a few different things. First of all, I want to go back to, you mentioned the investments the city's made in private security. I'm wondering what your response would be to those who would suggest that those investments don't really deal with or address any of the root causes of the other issue you just outlined so eloquently there.
Oh, absolutely, they don't. And I'm not pretending that they do. And I would like to think your listeners understand that. But in the meantime, we do have to protect people and property from theft, vandalism, harassment, to give people a sense of security. Otherwise, our downtown, in particular, and some of our neighborhoods are literally going to be depopulated, so to speak. I mean, businesses cannot survive if customers won't come through the door, and if customers don't feel secure, they're not doing it. The city's job, and I don't say this harshly, but I want to emphasize, as I've tried to over and over again, municipal governments, the city of Nanaimo in particular, does not deliver healthcare, addiction, or mental health services. We don't provide housing for people. We don't build and provide supportive housing. We don't manage it. That is not our job. We don't have the tax base. We don't have the legal responsibility, and we don't have the authority to do that. Those are, by and large, provincial and to some extent federal responsibilities. And you're absolutely, I say to those people, absolutely, you're right. Ensuring we don't have another tent city grow up and kill an area of our downtown, so to speak. That's what we hope to achieve, and ensure that people will still continue to walk our streets with a sense of security. But we're not going to fix somebody's mental health and or addiction issue or brain injury issue.
Right, and this is a conversation we've had a couple of times, yes, and I imagine you have had over and over and over again. I know you've spent a long time in the legislature in Victoria. I'm wondering, with that perspective, can you tell me how a place like Nanaimo could get help from the province in dealing with the issues we're discussing here? Like, we're talking about these neighbourhood safety audits, council's talking about the audits, but I imagine at the legislature in Victoria, they don't spend a lot of time discussing how people in Harewood don't feel safe. I guess, how in our system can we solve local issues when the people who wield the power to deal with them most are far removed and have so many other things competing for their attention?
Well, I mean, firstly, when you have an MLA, as we do, who is also the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions, whose office is right downtown, I can walk to Sheila Malcolmson's office in literally a minute from my office. That really helps. I mean, Sheila gets it. And I think, moreover, and most importantly, the government gets it, and we're all waiting to see even more action than is occurring already. You get attention by writing to ministers, by coverage, by discussions like we're having today that will be heard by hopefully all of your listeners, who may in turn be inspired to contact their MLA or MLAs, because the city has three basically, Doug Routley, Sheila Malcolmson, and Adam Walker in the North End. And or will write to the papers, to go, call into the radio shows, to keep up the political pressure. But the reason I'm feeling better than I was a year ago about this, and more optimistic, is that when the Premier established the Special Cabinet Committee with David Eby and Minister Malcolmson, Minister Farnworth, etc., and said, look, you guys have to come up with solutions, that gives me hope. And, there's ongoing work being done. You talked about solutions. How do you get the attention of the legislature? I think we've got their attention, not just individually, but we have got their attention collectively as people in the province. Because, for instance, the BC Urban Mayors Caucus that I belong to, there's 13 of us. We represent 55% of the population of British Columbia. We have had discussions, I'll call it face-to-face on Zoom, with the Premier, with Ministers Eby and Malcolmson, and Minister of Municipal Affairs Osborne, Minister Farnworth. We talked to Minister Fleming. I mean, there's a number of cabinet ministers we have met with and continue to meet with, raising these concerns, because this is one of the four things that's the real, the main ask from the BC Urban Mayors Caucus. So, I mean, that's how you draw attention to it. And you know what? It's not like it's just Nanaimo. Talk to the mayor of Prince George. Talk to the mayor of Terrace. Talk to the mayor of Cranbrook. Talk to the mayor of Moncton, New Brunswick, as I mentioned before, I believe, in one of your shows. This is a nationwide issue, and it is not going to be solved unless government steps up to the plate collectively. And as I have whined many times on other shows, other radio stations, and to the media, for COVID, we have found hundreds of billions of dollars, literally hundreds of billions of dollars, both at the federal and provincial level, to deal with the crisis in our streets. Can't we find a few $1 billion to deal with this? When COVID is gone, we will still have unhoused individuals living miserable lives in our streets. From a human perspective, imagine how it must feel if you have any level of self-awareness, and obviously people do. You're living in the streets, you have a mental health and addiction issue, there's no place for you to live, there aren't the supports in place, you're getting shuffled around by police and bylaw officers and businesses who don't want you sleeping in their doorways or whatever the case may be. It's a pretty horrible, bloody circumstance for a 21st century democracy. And I don't want to whine on too much here, but it is. And I am as I say, I'm optimistic that the government gets it and we'll start to see some real action in addition to what's happening now. You know, a 59-unit supportive housing facility on Nickel Street, it's being occupied by residents screened in literally as we speak. There is progress. There is progress.
Going back to away from sort of these broader nationwide issues and going back to the local, one thing you mentioned earlier on, and that really corresponds with what you just said, is the number of calls to Nanaimo RCMP are up, and oftentimes it's these calls out of fear. Someone is calling the police because, frankly, there's a homeless person walking around their neighborhood and they're scared. What would you say to those people to try and promote more understanding, or what should they do instead? Look,
firstly, dismiss from your mind several myths. Just because someone has a mental health issue does not mean they're a danger to you, does not mean they're going to attack you. If someone asks you for change and you find it upsetting, so be it, move on. But when you look at the actual statistics around people who are victimized by crime, assaults, thefts, whatever the case may be, the numbers don't support the level of fear. So you know what? Take back your street, so to speak. If you're not comfortable walking alone any time of the day, go with somebody else. But you'll find that you can move, generally speaking, in safety around our community. And for heaven's sakes, if you value this town, go to the stores, the local stores, particularly ones that are owned locally, where the money stays in our economy, and patronize them. Don't give up, but also don't be shy about lobbying your politicians at the federal and provincial level to deal with the issue. But and you know what? Get a safety if you're in a neighborhood. Undertake a safety audit. Work with Christy Wood at the RCMP and your neighborhood association and get an audit done. Do provide some basic protections. I mean, it's pretty shocking. I don't know if your station is on Constable Gary O'Brien's list for news reports from the RCMP, but there's still a shocking number of people who are astonished that their vehicles get broken into. Well, they're not really broken into because they weren't locked in the first place. I mean, I'm sorry, it's the 21st century and you're living in an urban setting, even in a rural setting. I mean, when my sainted mother was alive, she started locking the house just about 50 years ago. You have to take some measure of security yourself. Don't leave your valuable items lying in your vehicles. Lock your doors and windows, but exercise some common sense. But just remember, I mean, there isn't the kind of violence going on that people are concerned about. I'm not minimizing those who've suffered as a result or the fear that people have, but at the same time, put this in perspective.
One last thing I wanted to touch on before I let you go is one of the details mentioned in a lot of these neighborhood audits had to do with vacant properties and some of the problems those create, especially old ones along Nickel Street. I'm wondering what the city can do about those and if there are any, more creative measures being considered.
Yeah. Well, and I had this discussion this morning with someone who manages a property that's seeing a significant number of people occupying it. You are responsible for your own private property. If quote unquote folks start to camp on your private property, you've got a responsibility to get them off there. You can certainly call the police depending on their behavior, and they may assist you. But in terms of what we would call genuine nuisance properties, there are city bylaws to deal with those. If there's open drug dealing, criminal behavior, disturbance, etc. I mean, bylaws will enforce. It may take some time. We usually go through the city, when I say we, goes through a process, warning letters, etc., advising the owner, who has the ultimate legal responsibility, all the way up to seeking injunctions, fines, etc. There are steps that can be taken to deal with those vacant properties. But at the same time, I'm sad to say, unfortunately, some folks are just going to have to accept the fact that if they're not going to have a building on their property in an area frequented by people who are unhoused and living in miserable conditions, they may be forced to consider fencing and security steps privately, and that's sadly the way it is. But the RCMP are there. Our bylaws folks are run off their feet trying to deal with these issues all the time, of course.
Anything else you'd like people to know on any of these issues before I let you go?
Look, I think it's important that people understand that the council gets it. It's challenging for everybody. It's challenging for the people who are unhoused. It's challenging for those who are suffering from mental health, addiction, and brain injury issues. It's challenging for businesses. It's challenging for people who want to feel safe and walk their streets. But it's only going to get better, and I'm repeating myself now, it's only going to get better when we have the appropriate supports, facilities, and continuum of care. No one asks to be an addict. No one asks to develop a serious mental health issue. No one asks for a brain injury. Some of their behaviors may lead to that. I get it. And you can talk about blame and whatever. It doesn't. At the end of the day, we have issues with a lot of folks who need help and support, and it's only going to get better if the province and the feds, with enormous political pressure, step up.
All right. Thank you very much, Mayor Krog. We'll do our best to keep up that pressure.
A pleasure. Thank you.
Nanaimo Mayor Leonard Krog on Council's reaction to recently released Neighbourhood Safety Audits. You're listening to Midcoast Morning on CHLY. October is renowned for being the spookiest month on the calendar, with Halloween just over 3 weeks away. The Nanaimo Museum is putting on a variety of programming to mark the occasion and look into some of the creepier parts of our history. I spoke with Steph Kveton, program coordinator with the museum, to learn more. Let's talk a little bit about what the Nanaimo Museum has got going on to celebrate this spookiest of months.
Yeah. At Nanaimo Museum, we love Halloween. It's one of our favorite seasons, and October is always just like super busy and a lot of fun with lots of great programs. So this year we have kind of gone back to some of our pre-COVID activities and tours, and some of our pre-COVID tours are still kind of on the back burner until next year. So usually we would do a big Halloween weekend haunted coal mine day, where we decorate the coal mine exhibit, and we treat it like a haunted house. That's still not something that we are able to do this year. So that's off the list. However, instead, we are expanding that idea for Tales from the Vault Keeper. So we have a feature exhibit right now called From the Vault, and it is centered on some objects and some artifacts that don't always get a lot of play time. They're often just kept in storage. They haven't been on exhibit before. And it's a really fun opportunity to kind of highlight some of our favorites that not everybody else gets to see. So Tales from the Vault Keeper has been inspired by this feature exhibit, and it's sort of bringing back some of our favorite ghost stories, murder investigation boards, and decorations from Halloween's past at the museum. So we're kind of pulling that from the vault idea into our Halloween decorations. So these are all kind of spread throughout the gallery, not just in the coal mine this year. We won't be scaring anybody. We won't be doing any jump scares. That was part of our safety plan. However, there are different zones within the exhibits now where guests throughout the entire month of October can explore either creepy scenes that we've set up that don't have any local stories attached to them. They're just a creepy theme, or take a look at some panels and details taken from previous exhibits, previous walking tours that highlight some of the darker history of Nanaimo. One example is the murder investigation boards I mentioned. Those are from the Nanaimo Mysteries exhibit from a few years back, and those feature specific deaths in Nanaimo's history and kind of go through their whole timeline from what happened, what was the trial like, what was the verdict, and what are the controversies surrounding each case. So that's sort of a little overview of the gallery decorations. And those are up throughout the month. As well, we have an I Spy for our younger visitors. We have 13 black cats who have invaded the gallery that guests are welcome to explore and look for and see if they can spot all of them. Some of them are pretty hard to find, so it's a bit of a challenge this year.
That does sound like a lot.
In the gallery. Yeah.
I was really curious earlier. You mentioned that there was not going to be any jump scares because of the safety plan. Were there jump scares in the past? Is COVID something that has taken jump scares off the table?
For now, yes. We used to do the haunted coal mine, of course, and we did treat that sort of like a haunted house, where we had some staff members hidden around in the little corners and nooks within the coal mine exhibit, and it was sort of this run the gauntlet of going through the coal mine and having that fun moment of being frightened as you go through. So we had different themes. We had people jumping out at people, and just not a good time to be doing that and sort of in people's faces right now. Okay,
fair. And you were talking about some of the murders from our city's past. Do you think Nanaimo has a particularly spooky or grisly history compared with other places?
I don't know that I know enough about other places to answer that. I've certainly lived in a few other places and learned about their histories, but I think that we do have our own stories here. I think that there are, in the past, it has been sort of this is a hard question. We certainly have stories here of murders, of these sort of suspicious deaths, all of this. I think that is universal in every place. Every place has these stories, has these histories. I think that because of our interest in sort of this spooky season, and I think with the rise in sort of true crime media, that interest has grown. And so we've done more work as the years have gone on to bring out more of those stories from Nanaimo's past. So we have enough that we fill a couple of tours full of these stories. Some of our exhibits have featured many of these stories, and so we do spend time looking for it, I guess, is the is the answer there.
And I know one historical figure from Nanaimo's past who's kind of featuring in some special dedicated events is Brother 12. I found out about him myself shortly after coming to the town and thought, whoa, that's a really interesting character. Could you tell us a little bit about
so we are doing Brother 12 presentations again this year. This is a popular annual event that we hold where curator Amy Greenaway presents about Edward Wilson and or his followers. He's known as Brother 12. He was someone who discovered his spirituality and decided to share it with others. And that culminated in him becoming this cult figure here in Cedar by the Sea and on DeCourcy and Valdez Islands. And it led to high-profile court cases, scandals, conspiracy theories, everything that kind of is involved in cults or cultish organizations. So we often, every year, every October, we do these presentations where Amy, who has done several years of research into the topic, into Brother 12's, the conspiracy theories, the events surrounding his sort of rise and fall, and she does a presentation each year so that guests can come in and learn more about it, because it is this fascinating topic with so many myths and so many different stories wrapped up in it. And it's clear that he remains this like fascinating figure, even 70 years after his death? 90 years after his death.
And no coincidence that those presentations are this month.
No, it just kind of fits with the theme of it's not just for our programming at the museum. It's not just kind of ghosts and ghouls. We also do talk a lot about true crime at the museum around this time of year, and so it kind of fits in with that. There's a lot of Brother 12's story includes crime and criminal activity and scandals, so it really does kind of fit in with that direction that we take our programming in October.
Yeah, reading the historical plaques and even the Wikipedia page for Brother 12, it does sound like a kind of high-budget, glossy true crime podcast.
Absolutely.
To happen. I'm wondering if you want to take this chance to highlight anything else going on at the Nanaimo Museum, not necessarily for Halloween, but is there anything people should know about?
For sure. With these programs, we still have lots of space available in our Brother 12 presentations. So those are both in person or online, so you can visit our website to register for those. And we are, what else is happening? There's so much. Our lantern tours this year are sold out as of yesterday. So they are completely sold out at this point. So we will have more tours next year. And otherwise, we are continuing our exhibit of From the Vault until the end of November. And we have some exciting exhibits coming up in the new year that I'm not sure I can share with you.
Oh my goodness, classified information.
Yes.
Well, Steph, thank you so much for taking some time to speak with me about what's going on for the spectacular month of October at the Nanaimo Museum.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Steph Kveton, Program Coordinator for the Nanaimo Museum. You're listening to Midcoast Morning on CHLY. And finally, CHLY marked 20 years on the airwaves this week. As I recently found out, the work behind the station started long before October 5th, 2001. Here's a conversation I had with Dr. John Black, Professor Emeritus at Vancouver Island University, who was key to the formation of the station. Could you tell me a little bit about how CHLY came to be?
Certainly. The original idea for having a radio station in Nanaimo arose from my experience with Vancouver Cooperative Radio. I was a volunteer programmer there for 6 years. And during the time I was there, a group of people from Nanaimo were sort of working, I think it was a grant-supported project that they had, to work in community radio. And I met that group. I wasn't directly involved with them, but I acquired the sense that there was an interest in Nanaimo in having community radio. Fast forward about 4 years from that moment, and in 1990, I moved to Nanaimo to take a job at what was then Malaspina College, and it occurred to me that maybe this would be a suitable time. I was missing my involvement in co-op radio, being on the other side of the Salish Sea, and I decided that it would be a good moment to try to create a radio station campus community format in Nanaimo itself.
And what was that process like? What kind of hoops do you have to jump through to get a campus community radio station going when there is nothing before?
There are quite a few hoops. And so I'll tell you how we began, which was that we formed a society, like a non-profit society under the Society Act of BC. It was called the Nanaimo Educational and Community Media Society. And the purpose of that society was really to move the idea forward into a practical project of a certain kind. So we formed, we had a membership of something like 30 or 40 people, many of whom were students, but many of whom also were members of the community with an interest in radio and specifically in creating a radio station. And what one has to do to ultimately, and what this happened many years later, in fact, is that you have to apply to the CRTC, Canadian Radio and Television Commission, for a license to broadcast. Our plan was to broadcast eventually on the FM frequencies and in that mode. Although you have to satisfy a lot of different conditions. I won't go into them all because it's pretty complicated. But you have to satisfy that commission that, first of all, that you have all the engineering capability, that you have a site from which you can broadcast the signal, and that you have a studio from which you can create programming. And so that all of the technical side has to be taken care of, and you have to be able to sustain that over a period of time. And then secondly, on the programming side, there are you have to convince the commission that you can fulfill certain expectations on, for example, the proportion of spoken word programming as opposed to music. In a campus community station, there has to be a fairly high proportion of spoken word. There are certain regulations governing that. So it was a long project, and we didn't imagine anything would happen very quickly. We spent our time in the first years, so this would be during the 1990s, collecting equipment that was donated mostly by other radio stations which were converting to a digital production. So they would pass to us, when they did that, they could pass to us their mixing boards and what have you, all sorts of equipment that they were no longer going to be used. And we envisaged that as setting up the initial station. And then we started investigating the application for an FM license. We decided that we weren't yet capable of fulfilling the conditions required, both on the technical side and also on the programming side. We didn't have enough momentum. So out of that society, another society was formed which still exists. It's called the Radio Malaspina Society, Radio Malaspina being the working name for the station in those days. That society included many students from the college, and they had the bright idea, extremely good idea, of beginning by doing webcasting as opposed to broadcasting over the airwaves. So this allowed for the building up of that momentum that we had lacking. So all of a sudden we now had programmers, and they were programming was going out. A lot of it was music, but some of it wasn't. We didn't have to satisfy in those days the CRTC for the content of any webcasting. So it did build up a certain amount of momentum. And a small studio was built, if you like. It was in an office connected with the Navigator newspaper. So in the suite of rooms that they had for newspaper production, one of the rooms was given over initially to the radio station. It did then move to the Student Union building later in time, and the webcast was going out from there for a long time. At this point in time, I had sort of drawn back. It's when you get an organization that consists of students with, a couple of professors from a university or college, as it was then. There's a tendency for those older, perhaps more experienced figures, a little bit like me, to take over, and I felt that would be the wrong dynamic to set up. If this station was going to sustain itself, it had to be but the community members, but primarily the students who are going to keep it going.
And what would you hope becomes of CHLY in the future, maybe in the next 20 years?
That's a really good, interesting question. And it's, the station will find its own way to its future without my ideas. But, I think it's just to intensify some characteristics that it has at the moment. Spoken word programming, I think, is really important. Alternative public affairs programming, in particular, I think, is probably the most important role of community radio. If we listen to the CBC or any of the commercial stations, the range of views that are articulated in that context, say political views or views about important issues of the day, be it climate change or COVID-19 or whatever, they come from quite a narrow band of opinion. We might call it centrist or mainstream opinion. They're very Canadian media are very conscious of the need for, quotes, balance, but that means they balance, a center-right view against a center-left view, let's say. You don't get much in the way of progressive or alternative viewpoints being expressed fully by the people who hold those views. And that's, I think, the most important role for community media in general. And I think it's one that CHLY has taken on in its programming. And I would love, that aspect is, I guess I might say, I see it being sustained, and I really would want it sustained, but I also would encourage its growth.
That's a really interesting thing for me to hear you say, especially as the retired dean of social sciences at Vancouver Island University.
Yeah, and it goes with that job that I used to have, I suppose, but also with my general political directions. I also would like to, it's something on the educational side in my career, which is now finished. I'm retired from that. I've always tried to promote interesting approaches to learning, not just sitting in the lecture hall listening to someone like me blabber on, but something that involves a hands-on practice. And I would absolutely love to see, if it were possible, groups of students who are perhaps taking a course in sociology or in psychology or in political studies or whatever, working as interns or some kind of relationship like that with the radio station as volunteers, doing some programming, in which they can bring their school learning, if I can put it in those terms, into conversation with folks in the community who are working on specific issues, and the radio station being a forum for that conversation to take place.
Yeah, absolutely.
In a public way. Yeah,
there's definitely more room for that here. I know one show I've always been impressed in is the A Sound Constitution on CHLY, which I don't know if you're familiar with it, but I think it does exactly what you're talking about in a nursing context.
Right. Yeah.
Certainly a lot of room for that. Well, Dr. Black, thank you very much. I think everyone who has spent some time at CHLY owes you a deal of gratitude in getting the station off the ground and putting in 10 years of work before it could even broadcast to make it exist. So thank you for that from both me and everyone else. Do you have anything else you think people need to know about CHLY or 20 years on the air or the process of it getting started before I let you go?
No, that's fine. I just wanted to say that the way that if people owe me some gratitude, the way to pay that debt is just to continue doing what you're doing, because that's where the joy comes from for me.
Dr. John Black, Professor Emeritus at VIU, on the formation of CHLY. You can celebrate 20 years of community radio on the FM dial in Nanaimo by coming to CHLY's 20th anniversary concert, set for this Friday, October 15th. Tickets can be found at chly.ca/concert. That's it for the show this week, and for the next little while, that's it for me at the station as well. Next week, I'm starting an internship at the CBC and will be away for at least the next 6 weeks. It's been my pleasure bringing you the stories about what's going on in Nanaimo since the beginning of this summer, and I sincerely hope you found the show informative and engaging. Our theme music, as always, is Good Company from Nanaimo band Venice. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Midcoast Morning, saying once again, thank you so much for listening.